The morning of June 16th, 1944, Colonel Takashi Goto sat in the commander's position of his Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha medium tank, parked beneath a grove of palm trees 3 kilometers north of Charan Kanoa village, Saipan. Through the pre-dawn darkness, he could hear the rumble of American armor moving up from the invasion beaches. 44 tanks from his 9th Tank Regiment waited in concealed positions along both sides of the coastal road, engines idling, crews at battle stations. Goto had studied American tactics for months. He knew about their Sherman tanks, read intelligence reports about their firepower and armor. But those reports meant nothing against the reality he was about to face. His Type 97, even with its upgraded 47mm gun, represented the best tank Japan had fielded in combat. The angular turret, the high-velocity cannon developed specifically after bitter lessons learned at Khalkhin Gol against Soviet armor, these improvements made Goto confident. His orders were simple: attack at first light, drive the Americans back into the sea, retake the beaches before they could consolidate their beachhead. The plan made sense. Japanese tanks had never been employed in such numbers in the Pacific. This would be the largest armored attack Japan had mounted since the war began. 44 tanks, against perhaps 30 or 40 American tanks moving through the darkness toward them. The mathematics seemed favorable, but Goto didn't know about the production statistics. He didn't know about Detroit. He didn't know about the 5 million tons of steel that stood behind every Sherman rolling toward his position. What Goto was about to discover, what every Japanese tank commander would learn through fire and steel in the coming months, was not just that they were outmatched vehicle for vehicle. It was that they were facing an industrial system so vast, so overwhelming, that tactical excellence became irrelevant in the face of material abundance. At 05:45 hours, as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, Colonel Goto gave the order to attack. What followed in the next 3 hours would not be a tank battle. It would be a revelation, a demonstration that modern war was no longer won by warrior spirit or tactical brilliance, but by the cold arithmetic of industrial production. Within minutes, Goto would understand what German tankers had already learned in Europe. That America wasn't just winning with better tanks. America was winning by building more tanks than their enemies could ever hope to destroy. And behind those tanks stood an industrial capacity that Japan, with its entire manufacturing base, could not match if given a decade. The revelation would come too late for Goto and his regiment, but the lesson would echo through the remainder of the Pacific War, transforming how Japan understood the conflict they had entered and why they had already lost it the moment the first Sherman rolled off an American assembly line. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of Japan's tank development began with optimism and ambition. In 1937, when the Imperial Japanese Army issued specifications for a new medium tank, they believed they were building a weapon that would dominate Asian battlefields. The Type 97 Chi-Ha was designed to replace the aging Type 89, which had proven too slow to keep pace with motorized infantry during the invasion of Manchuria. Engineers at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries created what seemed like a capable machine. 14 tons of riveted steel armor, ranging from 8mm on the bottom to 26mm on the turret sides. A Mitsubishi air-cooled diesel engine producing 170 horsepower, giving a top speed of 32 kilometers per hour. The main armament was a 57mm Type 97 gun, designed for infantry support rather than anti-tank combat. 4 crew members operated the vehicle: a driver, a hull machine gunner who also served as radio operator, a commander who doubled as gunner, and a loader. This 2-man turret arrangement, with the commander forced to aim and fire the gun while also directing the tank's movements, would prove a critical tactical disadvantage, but in 1937 it seemed adequate. The Type 97 first saw combat in China in 1938. Against lightly equipped Chinese forces, armed mostly with small arms and limited anti-tank weapons, the Chi-Ha performed admirably. Japanese tank commanders watched their machines roll through enemy positions, the 57mm guns destroying defensive positions, the armor proof against most Chinese weapons. Victory followed victory. The tanks fulfilled their infantry support role exactly as designed. But then came Khalkhin Gol. In the summer of 1939, along the disputed Mongolian-Manchurian border, Japanese forces clashed with the Soviet Union in what would become a preview of industrial warfare. The 4th Tank Regiment, equipped with Type 97 tanks, engaged Soviet armor near the Khalkhin River on August 20, 1939. The encounter lasted 3 hours. In that time, Japanese tank crews discovered their 57mm guns could not penetrate Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks at normal combat ranges. The Soviet 45mm guns, with their higher muzzle velocity, could destroy Type 97s from distances where Japanese return fire proved ineffective. The command tank of the 3rd Tank Regiment received a single hit and exploded. Other Type 97s maneuvered desperately, trying to close the range, but Soviet tanks simply backed away, maintaining distance while methodically destroying Japanese armor. When the battle ended, Japanese losses were severe. Not catastrophic, only 4 Type 97s were destroyed that day, but the implications were devastating. The tank Japan had built to dominate Asian warfare was already obsolete against modern opposition. Intelligence officers prepared urgent reports. The army recognized the problem. Development of a new 47mm gun began immediately in the autumn of 1939. Engineers worked for 2 years, designing a high-velocity weapon specifically to counter Soviet tanks. The Type 1 47mm tank gun, completed at the end of 1941, generated significantly higher muzzle velocity than the original 57mm weapon. It could penetrate armor that the old gun could not touch. But the new gun required modifications. A larger, 3-man turret with angular faceted armor replaced the original rounded design. The upgraded tank, designated Type 97 Kai or Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha, entered production in 1942. From the outside, the difference was obvious. The new turret was larger, more angular, with a prominent gun mantlet protecting the 47mm weapon. Maximum armor thickness increased from 26mm to 33mm. The weight rose slightly to 14.8 tons. Japanese tank commanders welcomed the improvements. The new Shinhoto Chiha first saw combat in May 1942 during the Battle of Corregidor in the Philippines. Against American M3 Stuart light tanks, the 47mm gun proved devastatingly effective. Japanese tankers watched their shells penetrate Stuart armor at ranges the Americans couldn't match. The battle ended in crushing Japanese victory. Reports flowed back to Tokyo describing the Shinhoto Chiha as a war-winning weapon. Production increased. By mid-1943, approximately 300 original Type 97 tanks had been converted to the Shinhoto configuration, while new production tanks incorporated the improved turret from the start. The Imperial Japanese Army fielded these tanks across the Pacific. They equipped the 9th Tank Regiment on Saipan. They formed the core of the 1st Tank Division. They represented Japan's best armored fighting vehicle, the most advanced tank Japanese industry could produce in meaningful numbers. Japanese commanders studied the specifications with satisfaction. 47mm gun, penetration of approximately 70 to 80mm of vertical armor at 1,000 meters. Maximum armor of 33mm, proof against most Allied light tank weapons, speed of 38 km per hour on roads, operating range of 210 km. By the standards of 1942, facing Allied light armor, the Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha was adequate. Against Soviet BT tanks or British Crusaders or American Stuarts, Japanese crews could fight with reasonable confidence of victory. But adequate in 1942 meant obsolete by 1943, because while Japan was upgrading its existing tanks with slightly better guns, America was doing something completely different. America was building an entirely new kind of tank, and America was building it by the tens of thousands. The Sherman tank emerged not from military perfection, but from industrial pragmatism. On August 31, 1940, at Aberdeen Proving Ground, U.S. Army Ordnance presented requirements that delighted production experts but horrified traditional military engineers. The specifications emphasized not excellence, but sufficiency. Simple enough for inexperienced workers to build. Parts interchangeable between all variants. Engines capable of running on multiple fuel types. Armor plates that could be welded rather than precisely fitted. Tracks that crews could replace under field conditions. A turret ring wide enough to accept future upgrades. Major General Gladion Barnes, head of Army Ordnance, told assembled contractors, "I don't want a perfect tank. I want a good enough tank that we can build 1,000 of them for every 100 the Germans build. Make it reliable, make it fixable, and make it by the tens of thousands." The M4 Sherman that emerged from this philosophy weighed 31 tons. Frontal hull armor ranged from 51 to 64 millimeters, heavily sloped for maximum effectiveness. The turret front measured 76 millimeters thick. The main armament was a 75 millimeter M3 gun, capable of firing high explosive, armor-piercing, and smoke rounds. A 400 horsepower engine provided reasonable speed and excellent reliability. The critical difference wasn't just specifications, it was a production philosophy. At Chrysler's Detroit Tank Arsenal, opened September 15, 1941, the factory covered 1.2 to 5 million square feet, larger than all Japanese tank factories combined. The workforce consisted not of master craftsmen, but of former automobile workers, housewives, teenagers, anyone who could learn to operate a riveting gun or welding torch in 2 days of training. Rose Wilman Rowe, who became the model for Rosie the Riveter propaganda, worked on Sherman production. She later described the experience. "I'd never seen a tank before I started building them. They gave us 2 days of training, then put us on the line. Everything was broken down into simple steps. I'd weld one seam, the tank would move. Someone else would weld the next. We'd finish a tank in 48 hours. Detroit Tank Arsenal alone produced 896 Shermans monthly by December 1942. But Detroit was just one factory. Across America, 11 plants were built by Shermans. Grand Blanc Tank Arsenal produced 385 monthly. Lima Locomotive Works, 165 monthly. Pressed Steel Car Company, 320 monthly. Pacific Car and Foundry, 280 monthly. Federal Machine and Welder, 240 monthly. American Locomotive Company, 310 monthly. Baldwin Locomotive Works, 205 monthly. Pullman Standard Car Company, 385 monthly. In Canada, Montreal Locomotive Works produced 180 monthly, while Angus Shops added 145. Total monthly production by December 1942, approximately 3,500 Sherman tanks, every single month. Japan's entire tank production, all types combined, averaged approximately 120 tanks monthly during the same period. The ratio was already 29-1, and American production was still ramping up. By mid-1943, monthly Sherman production exceeded 2,000 units. The math was brutally simple. America was building more tanks in 1 month than Japan could build in a year. But Japanese commanders didn't know these numbers. Intelligence reports suggested American production was high, but estimates consistently underestimated actual output by 50% or more. Japanese military planners, trained in traditions of warrior spirit and tactical excellence, couldn't conceive of an industrial system operating at such scale. They looked at American tanks and saw individual machines to be defeated in individual battles. They didn't see the factories. They didn't see Detroit working 3 shifts, 24 hours daily. They didn't see the steel mills of Pittsburgh pouring 95 million tons of steel into the war effort. They didn't see the supply ships, the countless Liberty ships being launched at a rate of 3 per day, each one carrying hundreds of tanks, thousands of spare parts, millions of rounds of ammunition. Japanese tank crews trained with the weapons they had. They practiced tactics. They learned to use terrain. They prepared to face American armor with courage and skill. What they couldn't prepare for was mathematics, the arithmetic of industrial warfare that would render their courage irrelevant and their tactics meaningless. On Saipan, in the pre-dawn darkness of June 16, 1944, Colonel Goto and his 44 tanks represented Japan's largest armored commitment in the Pacific War. It seemed like a powerful force. 44 modern tanks, equipped with the best gun Japan could produce, manned by experienced crews, attacking in coordinated formation. Against 30 or 40 American tanks, it might have been a fair fight, but the Americans didn't bring 30 or 40 tanks to Saipan. The invasion force included 150 tanks. Over 100 of them were M4 Shermans. The 2-to-1 numerical advantage was just the beginning. Behind those 150 tanks on Saipan stood the entire American industrial base. Behind every Sherman, rolling through the darkness toward Colonel Goto's position, stood the Detroit tank arsenal, the steel mills of Pennsylvania, the shipyards that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. Behind every Sherman stood 5 million tons of steel annually. Behind every Sherman stood an economic system that produced abundance through freedom rather than scarcity through control. Colonel Goto couldn't see that in the darkness. He could only see the immediate tactical situation. 44 Japanese tanks against perhaps 40 American tanks. The numbers seemed reasonable. But when the battle began at 05:45 hours, when his Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha tanks rolled out of concealment and opened fire, reality arrived with devastating force. The American Sherman tanks that Goto's crews engaged were not isolated machines. They were parts of a system. Behind them came tank destroyers, half-tracks with 75mm guns, bazooka teams, artillery, naval gunfire from offshore destroyers. The Japanese attack hit not a vulnerable column, but a combined arms force that responded with overwhelming firepower. Goto watched his lead tanks fire. The 47mm guns cracked. Armor-piercing rounds struck Sherman hulls. Some penetrated, some bounced off the sloped frontal armor, and the Shermans, rather than withdrawing or maneuvering defensively, simply returned fire. The 75mm guns of the Shermans fired high-explosive rounds. Not armor-piercing, high-explosive, because American tank crews had learned that armor-piercing rounds went straight through Japanese tanks without stopping. The thin armor of the Type 97, even the improved Shinhoto model, couldn't trigger the fuse of armor-piercing rounds designed to penetrate German Panthers and Tigers. So Sherman crews loaded high-explosive shells. The effect was catastrophic. High-explosive rounds didn't need to penetrate armor. They struck the thin plates of Japanese tanks and detonated on impact. The blast effect tore through riveted construction. Entire turrets were blown off. Crews were killed instantly by overpressure. Goto watched his first platoon, 4 tanks, be destroyed in less than 3 minutes. He ordered the second wave to advance, trying to close the distance, trying to get to ranges where his guns would be more effective against Sherman side armor. But the Americans had artillery support. Naval destroyers offshore opened fire with 5-inch guns. One Japanese tank literally exploded, blown apart by a direct hit from a naval shell at 7 in the morning. Infantry with bazookas, the new 2.36-inch rocket launchers, fired from concealed positions. The bazookas were devastating. They penetrated Japanese tank armor with ease. By dawn, 31 of Goto's 44 tanks lay burning across the battlefield. The attack had lasted less than 3 hours. General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding Japanese forces on Saipan, had gambled everything on this armored assault. He had committed nearly all available tank forces in one decisive blow intended to drive the Americans back into the sea. Instead, he had witnessed the destruction of Japan's largest tank formation in a single morning. The survivors, 13 battered Type 97 tanks, retreated inland. They would spend the remaining weeks of the battle dug into fixed positions, used as pillboxes rather than mobile armor, because Japanese commanders had learned the hard lesson. Their tanks could not maneuver against American firepower. They could not win through tactical excellence. They could only die. The Battle of Saipan would continue until July 9, 1944. American forces would declare the island secure after brutal fighting that cost 3,000 American dead and over 30,000 Japanese killed. But the tank battle was over on the morning of June 16th. 31 tanks were destroyed in 3 hours. The largest Japanese armoured attack in Pacific history, crushed in a single morning. And yet, Even this devastating defeat was merely a symptom of a deeper problem that Japanese commanders were only beginning to comprehend. The tactical loss, 31 tanks destroyed, was painful but not strategically decisive. Japan had lost individual battles before and continued fighting. What made Saipan different was what came after. When American tank units suffered losses at Saipan, replacement tanks arrived within days. Damaged Shermans were repaired or scrapped for parts. New tanks came ashore, fresh from American factories, complete with trained crews, full ammunition loads, adequate fuel supplies. The American tank force on Saipan never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger as the battle progressed. Japanese forces, in contrast, could not replace their losses. The 31 tanks destroyed on June 16th represented irreplaceable assets. Japan's entire tank production for June 1944 was approximately 120 tanks of all types, distributed across all fronts: China, Burma, Manchuria, Home Island Defense, and the Pacific. Saipan would receive no replacements. What was lost stayed lost. This was the revelation that Japanese commanders had failed to understand when they entered the war. Modern industrial warfare was not about tactical excellence. It was about production capacity. It was about replacing losses faster than enemies could inflict them. It was about sustaining operations through material abundance that made individual battles irrelevant to the final outcome. Japan had built approximately 2,000 Type 97 Chi-Ha tanks in all variants between 1938 and 1943. The production rate peaked at 70 tanks monthly and declined from there. In the time it took Japan to build one Type 97, America built 25 Shermans. The disparity extended beyond tanks. A single Sherman required approximately 18 tons of steel. Japan's total steel production in 1944 was approximately 6.5 million tons, divided among all military and civilian needs. America's steel production in 1944 exceeded 80 million tons. The technical specifications told part of the story, but they didn't tell the whole truth. On paper, the Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha seemed capable of fighting Shermans. The 47mm gun could penetrate Sherman's side and rear armor at normal combat ranges. Japanese tank crews, when they caught Shermans from favorable angles, could achieve kills. Lieutenant Sadao Takahashi of the 9th Tank Regiment described one such engagement on Guam in July 1944. We ambushed 3 Sherman tanks moving along a narrow trail. Our position was perfect, hull down, concealed by jungle growth, firing at their flanks from 70 meters. We destroyed all 3, with 11 shots. But when we tried to withdraw, American artillery found us within minutes. 2 of our 4 tanks were destroyed before we could escape. This pattern repeated across the Pacific. Japanese tanks could win individual engagements when conditions favored them. Ambush positions, flanking shots, close quarters in jungle terrain. The Type 97's gun was adequate for the task, but winning individual engagements meant nothing when the destroyed Shermans were replaced within hours, while destroyed Japanese tanks could never be replaced at all. The deeper problem lay not in firepower but in systems. The Sherman was designed as part of an integrated combined arms doctrine. American tanks operated with infantry support, artillery coordination, air cover, and most critically, comprehensive logistics. Every Sherman battalion included maintenance companies with complete sets of spare parts. Recovery vehicles could retrieve damaged tanks under fire. Repair depots could rebuild damaged Shermans using standardized components that fit any variant. Japanese tanks operated in isolation. Maintenance capabilities were minimal. Spare parts were scarce and often didn't fit between variants. Recovery vehicles were virtually non-existent. A tank damaged in combat was typically abandoned because crews lacked the equipment to recover it. The Mitsubishi diesel engine that powered the Type 97 was reliable when properly maintained, but proper maintenance required tools, spare parts, and trained mechanics that Japanese units often lacked. Sergeant Masao Tanaka, a maintenance specialist with the 2nd Tank Division, described the problems in his post-war account. We had excellent engines. The Mitsubishi diesel was efficient, powerful for its size, and could run on various fuel grades, but we had no spare parts. If a fuel pump failed, the tank was finished. If transmission gears wore out, we couldn't replace them. I watched good tanks sit useless because we lacked a 10 yen part that would take weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. Meanwhile, I watched American maintenance crews replace entire Sherman engines in half a day. They had everything. We had nothing. The logistics disparity extended to ammunition. Japanese 47mm armor-piercing rounds were effective when they penetrated, but production quantities were limited. Tank units often went into battle with mixed loads, including older 57mm ammunition from converted tanks, various grades of armor-piercing rounds, and high explosive shells of inconsistent quality. American 75mm ammunition was produced in staggering quantities at consistent quality. Each Sherman carried 71 main gun rounds as standard load. Resupply was continuous and generous. If a Sherman crew expended their entire ammunition load, fresh supplies arrived within hours. Japanese crews learned to conserve ammunition because resupply was uncertain at best, impossible at worst. The operational differences became most apparent in crew training and replacement. American tank crews received extensive training, typically 12 to 16 weeks, at dedicated facilities with ample practice ammunition and running hours on actual tanks. After training, crews shipped to combat units as cohesive teams. If a crew suffered casualties, trained replacements arrived from the United States within weeks. Japanese tank crew training varied wildly. Early war crews received thorough instruction, sometimes 4 to 6 months of training. But as the war progressed and losses mounted, training periods shortened dramatically. By 1944, new tank crews sometimes received as little as 3 weeks instruction before assignment to combat units. Practice ammunition was scarce. Running hours on actual tanks decreased because fuel was needed for operations, not training. Replacement crews, when available at all, were often inadequately prepared. The result was predictable. American tank units maintained consistent combat effectiveness because losses were replaced with trained personnel. Japanese tank units degraded steadily as experienced crews were killed, and inadequately trained replacements failed to match their effectiveness. Colonel Takeo Yamazaki, who commanded tank operations in the Philippines in 1944, wrote bitterly about this disparity in his post-war memoirs. I watched American tank companies fight for weeks, suffering casualties, losing vehicles, but always maintaining strength because replacements arrived constantly. Men, tanks, ammunition, fuel, parts, everything they needed just appeared. My units could only decline. Every man lost was irreplaceable. Every tank destroyed was gone forever. Every shot fired was one less in our magazines. We were fighting not an enemy army but an enemy economy, and economies don't care about tactical victories. The American economic power behind each Sherman manifested in unexpected ways. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Marine Corps tank crews on Saipan noted that damaged Shermans were often simply abandoned rather than repaired if recovery looked difficult. Not because the tanks couldn't be fixed, but because getting a new tank was easier than recovering the old one. Sergeant William Henderson, 4th Tank Battalion, described the attitude. We had a Sherman throw a track in a bad spot, under Japanese observation. The battalion commander looked at it and said, "Leave it. We'll get another one." Just like that. Leave a 30-ton tank because it's easier to get a new one than fix this one. That told you everything about how this war was going. The Japanese couldn't conceive of such abundance. To Japanese tankers, each vehicle was precious, irreplaceable. Crews risked their lives recovering damaged tanks because losing the tank meant losing combat, power that could never be restored. The different relationships with material shaped tactical behavior. American crews readily abandoned damaged tanks because they knew they'd get another one. Japanese crews fought to the death, defending their tanks because without the tank, they had nothing. This psychological difference manifested in casualty rates. Of approximately 8,000 Japanese tank crewmen who served in the Pacific War, fewer than 1,000 survived. a casualty rate approaching 87%. Of approximately 50,000 American tank crewmen who served in the Pacific, around 600 died in combat, a casualty rate of 1.2%. The disparity wasn't explained by Japanese fanaticism or American cowardice. It was explained by doctrine born from material reality. Americans valued crews over machines because machines were replaceable. Japanese valued machines over crews because machines were not replaceable. The doctrine that saved American lives and killed Japanese soldiers emerged directly from production statistics. The industrial foundations of the Sherman's superiority were visible in the most basic comparisons. To build one Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha required approximately 300 skilled workers, laboring for 800 man-hours. The riveted construction demanded careful fitting. The hand-assembled transmission required precise adjustment. Quality control involved multiple inspections of critical components. The result was a well-made tank, built to standards that would have satisfied any engineering specification. But it took 800 man-hours to produce. A Sherman, built on assembly lines at Detroit Tank Arsenal, required approximately 200 man-hours of labor. The welded construction eliminated fitting requirements. The modular design meant subassemblies were built in parallel and simply bolted together. Quality control was standardized and mechanical. The result was an adequate tank, built to standards of sufficiency rather than excellence. But it took 200 man-hours to produce. The 4-to-1 ratio in production time meant America could build 4 Shermans, while Japan built 1 Chiha, using the same total labor hours. But America wasn't using the same labor hours. America was using vastly more. The Detroit Tank Arsenal employed 12,000 workers at peak production. Japan's largest tank factory, Mitsubishi's Tokyo facility, employed 3,000 workers. The total workforce building Shermans across all American and Canadian factories exceeded 60,000 people. Japan's total tank production workforce, all factories combined, was approximately 12,000 workers. The 5-to-1 workforce ratio, multiplied by the 4-to-1 efficiency ratio, meant American production potential was 20 times greater than Japanese production, and this was just tanks. The same ratios applied to aircraft, ships, trucks, artillery, ammunition, everything needed for modern war. The steel consumption figures illustrated the gap most starkly. A single Sherman required approximately 18 tons of steel. American production of 49,000 Shermans consumed roughly 880,000 tons of steel. This represented about 1% of American steel production during the war years. Japan's total steel production in 1944 was 6.5 million tons, divided among all military needs, civilian industry, and export commitments. If Japan had devoted 10% of its total steel production solely to tank manufacturing, matching the American percentage, they could have built approximately 3,600 tanks using Sherman steel requirements, but Japan couldn't devote 10% to tanks. Steel was needed for ships, aircraft, artillery, fortifications, and 1,000 other military requirements. In practice, Japanese tank production consumed perhaps 1% of available steel, the same percentage as America. But 1% of 6.5 million tons yielded far fewer tanks than 1% of 80 million tons. The mathematics of defeat were written in production statistics that preceded any battlefield encounter. Japanese military planners knew about American industrial capacity in abstract terms. Intelligence reports detailed American factory output, steel production, labor force statistics. But knowing numbers was different from understanding their implications. The Imperial General Headquarters, reviewing American production figures in late 1943, concluded that while American output was impressive, it would be diluted across multiple theaters. Europe would consume the majority of American tanks. The Pacific would receive only limited numbers. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. American production was so vast that even secondary theaters received equipment in quantities that dwarfed Japanese total production. The Philippines campaign of 1944 saw American forces deploy over 300 tanks. The largest Japanese tank commitment in response was the 2nd Tank Division, with approximately 120 tanks. The 3-to-1 American numerical advantage, combined with qualitative superiority in armor, firepower, and support systems, made Japanese defeat inevitable before the first shot was fired. At Luzon in January 1945, American tank battalions destroyed Japanese armor so efficiently that Japanese commanders stopped using tanks for mobile operations entirely. The Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha, designed for maneuver warfare, was instead dug into fixed positions as static pillboxes. Immobilized tanks lost their primary advantage, mobility becoming merely thickly armored gun emplacements that could be bypassed or destroyed with high explosives. Lieutenant Colonel Toshio Nakajima, commanding a tank company on Luzon, explained the decision in a captured diary recovered after his death. To send our tanks against Sherman formations is suicide. They destroy us at ranges where we cannot effectively return fire. They have unlimited ammunition, unlimited fuel, unlimited replacements. We have 14 tanks, and what ammunition we carried ashore. I have ordered my tanks buried in their turrets. At least as pillboxes, they might kill some Americans before they are destroyed. This is all we can do. The transformation of Japanese armor from mobile force to static defense illustrated the complete failure of their pre-war planning. The Type 97 had been designed for aggressive maneuver operations, supporting infantry assaults, exploiting breakthroughs. By 1945, Japanese tanks could do none of these things because attempting mobile operations against American firepower was simply mass suicide. The material disparity affected every aspect of armored operations. American tank units advanced with dedicated engineer support bulldozers to clear obstacles, bridge-laying equipment to cross gaps, mine-clearing tanks to breach defensive lines. Japanese tanks operated without such support. If they encountered obstacles, crews dismounted and cleared them by hand. If they needed to cross streams, they forded them or turned back. American tanks communicated through radio networks that connected every vehicle in the battalion to supporting infantry, artillery, and air support. Japanese tanks often lacked radios entirely. In units that had radios, communication was usually limited to the company commander's tank. Individual tanks communicated through hand signals or by dismounting and walking between vehicles. The operational tempo difference was dramatic. American tank units sustained continuous operations for days or weeks because logistics kept them supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Japanese tank units operated in spurts, a few hours of action, followed by long periods of resupply and maintenance that might take days or weeks, depending on whether supplies could reach the unit at all. Captain James Peterson, 5th Tank Battalion, described encountering a Japanese tank position on Okinawa. We found 6 Type 97s dug in along a ridge. Good positions, well camouflaged. We called in artillery and airstrikes, then moved in with infantry support. It took about 4 hours to destroy all 6 tanks. What surprised me was finding them out of fuel. They couldn't move even if they wanted to. They'd probably been sitting there for weeks, waiting for fuel that never came. That was the Japanese problem. In one picture, good tanks, good positions, no fuel to move, no ammunition to sustain fire, no replacements coming. The human cost of material inferiority was staggering. Japanese tank crews understood they were outmatched. They understood their tanks were obsolete, their ammunition inadequate, their support non-existent. But they fought anyway because Japanese military culture left no alternative. Surrender was unthinkable. Retreat was cowardice. The only acceptable option was death in battle. Corporal Hiroshi Nakamura, who survived the tank battle on Saipan only to be killed on Guam a month later, wrote to his family in a last letter recovered after his death. "We know the American tanks are superior. We know they have unlimited numbers while we have so few. We know that fighting them is death. But what choice do we have? To surrender is dishonor. To retreat is abandonment of duty. We will fight until our tanks are destroyed, and then we will fight on foot until we are killed. This is what it means to serve the Emperor. This is all we can do." This fatalism, born from the collision between military tradition and material reality, cost Japan an entire generation of trained tank crewmen. Men who might have contributed to post-war rebuilding died in hopeless battles defending obsolete equipment against overwhelming force. The waste was recognized even by Japanese commanders who ordered these hopeless defenses. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, wrote privately about the futility of tank operations against American firepower. Our tank units are brave and determined, but bravery means nothing against the material superiority the Americans possess. They destroy our tanks like shooting targets at a range. I have ordered tanks buried as pillboxes because it is the only way to make any use of them before they are inevitably destroyed. This is not warfare. This is industrial murder. By the final year of the war, Japanese tank development had stalled completely. The Type 3 Chi-Nu, mounting a 75mm gun comparable to the Sherman's weapon, was developed in 1943 but barely entered production before war's end. Only about 60 were built. The Type 4 Chi-2, with a 75mm high-velocity gun and improved armor, was even more delayed. Perhaps 2 were completed before surrender. The Type 5 Chi-Ri, Japan's answer to American medium tanks, was still in prototype testing when the war ended. These tanks, particularly the Chi-2 and Chi-Ri, approached Sherman capabilities in firepower and armor, but approaching capability meant nothing when production capacity was measured in dozens rather than thousands. Japan couldn't build them fast enough to matter. Even if Japanese industry had successfully produced these improved tanks in meaningful numbers, they would have faced the same systemic problems that doomed the Type 97: lack of spare parts, inadequate maintenance support, insufficient training, limited ammunition, scarce fuel, and above all, inability to replace losses. The basic problem wasn't tank design, it was industrial capacity. The strategic consequences of the tank production gap extended beyond battlefield defeats. The Battle of Saipan, where Colonel Goto's 9th Tank Regiment was destroyed, placed American B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo. By November 1944, B-29 seconds from Saipan bases began systematic bombing of Japanese cities and industry. The very factories that built tanks came under direct attack. Mitsubishi's Tokyo facility, which produced Type 97 tanks, was heavily damaged in B-29 raids during early 1945. Production dropped from 70 tanks monthly to fewer than 20. By May 1945, tank production had essentially ceased, not because Japan ran out of designs or blueprints, but because American bombers had destroyed the factories, killed the workers, and interdicted the steel supplies needed for manufacture. The Americans could lose dozens of Shermans on Saipan and replace them within weeks from factories safely located in Detroit, 8,000 miles from the nearest Japanese aircraft. Japan could lose 31 tanks on Saipan and never replace them because their factories were being systematically destroyed by bombers operating from the very island where those tanks had been lost. This strategic feedback loop, losing battles that enabled bombing campaigns that destroyed production capacity, that made losing future battles inevitable, characterized Japan's final year of war. Every defeat compounded future defeats by bringing American forces closer to Japanese industry. Every loss of territory meant loss of resources, loss of production, loss of ability to sustain operations. The Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha, Japan's best tank design to see significant combat, ended the war having achieved nothing strategically. Individual crews fought bravely. Individual tanks killed American soldiers and destroyed American equipment. But these tactical successes meant nothing against the industrial arithmetic that determined the war's outcome. Japan produced approximately 2,000 Type 97 tanks in all variants. America produced 49,234 Shermans. Even if every Japanese tank destroyed 10 Shermans a ratio, never. Approached in actual combat, Japan would still run out of tanks, while America still had half its production unused. The actual exchange ratio on Saipan was roughly 31 Japanese tanks destroyed for fewer than 10 American tanks knocked out. And those 10 American tanks were replaced within days, while the 31 Japanese tanks represented irreplaceable losses. This was the revelation that Japanese commanders experienced at Saipan, but had experienced before on Guam, Peleliu, and every other Pacific battlefield. They were not fighting an enemy army, they were fighting an enemy economy. An economy so vast that tactical excellence became meaningless, Strategic planning became futile, and defeat became mathematically inevitable from the moment American industry began full production. The morning after the tank battle on Saipan, American burial details began the grim work of clearing the battlefield. 31 burned-out Type 97 hulks littered the coastal road north of Charankanoa. Inside many of them, Japanese crew remains were found still at their stations. Commanders slumped over radios. Gunners gripped controls. Loaders clutched shells they never had a chance to fire. Marine Corps photographer Sergeant John Ercole walked among the wreckage, documenting the destruction. He later wrote in his diary, "These Japanese tankers died doing exactly what they'd been trained to do, fighting against impossible odds without retreating. Their tanks were junk compared to ours, but they fought like they were driving tigers. It was brave, and it was pointless, and it was sad." Colonel Takashi Goto's body was never positively identified. Japanese records list him as killed in action on June 16, 1944, location Saipan. His 9th Tank Regiment effectively ceased to exist that morning. Of approximately 300 officers and men in the regiment, fewer than 40 survived the battle for Saipan. Most died not in tanks but fighting as infantry, during the final desperate weeks of the campaign. The families in Japan who received notification that their sons or husbands had died on Saipan were told they had fallen gloriously in defense of the empire. What they were not told was that their men had died in obsolete tanks, outnumbered 3-1, facing an industrial system that could replace in one day what Japan could build in 1 month. The strategic impact of Saipan's fall reverberated through Japan. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned on July 18, 1944, taking responsibility for the defeat. The emperor himself, upon learning that Saipan was lost, reportedly said, "Then Tokyo is within bombing range. The war is now at our doorstep." He was correct. By November 19, 1944, B-29, superfortresses began regular bombing missions against Tokyo from bases on Saipan. The firebombing campaign that followed would kill more Japanese civilians than both atomic bombs combined. The tank battle that destroyed the 9th Tank Regiment had enabled the capture of bases that enabled the bombing campaign that destroyed Japanese cities and industry. The connections between tactical defeat and strategic catastrophe could not have been more direct. For the surviving Japanese tank crewmen scattered across the Pacific, the lesson of Saipan spread through official reports and unofficial soldier communication. Lieutenant Sadao Takahashi, who had described the successful ambush on Guam, survived the war and wrote extensively about Japanese armor operations in his memoir published in 1952. After we learned what happened on Saipan, Takahashi wrote, "Every tank commander understood we could not win through combat. The Americans had too many tanks, too much ammunition, too much everything. Our only hope was to make them pay such a high price that they would negotiate peace. But even this hope was fantasy. They could afford any price. We could afford nothing." Doomed Japanese armor applied across every category of military equipment. Japan produced approximately 76,000 aircraft during the entire war. America produced 300,000 aircraft. Japan launched 92,000 tons of new naval vessels in 1944. America launched millions of tons. The disparity in trucks, artillery, small arms, and ammunition followed the same pattern. Industrial capacity determined everything. Japan entered the war believing that warrior spirit and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantage. They learned, at a cost of millions of lives, that modern industrial warfare rendered such beliefs obsolete. The assembly line defeated the warrior tradition. The factory defeated the dojo. The production schedule defeated the battle plan. In the post-war period, Japanese military analysts conducted extensive studies of their defeat. The conclusion was unanimous and bitter. Japan had lost the war not on battlefields, but in factories. Or more precisely, Japan lost the war because they lacked the factories to compete with American production. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, who had led successful tank operations in 1942, wrote from prison before his execution for war crimes in 1946, "We won when we were fighting British and American forces of similar size to our own. We defeated them in Malaya, in the Philippines, across the Pacific, in those first months. But we were never fighting armies. We were fighting economies. Once American industry mobilized fully, once the tanks and planes and ships began arriving in unlimited numbers, the war was over. We just didn't know it yet. The American tank crews who fought at Saipan returned home after the war to a nation that celebrated their victory, but rarely asked about the enemy they had faced. Staff Sergeant Robert Morrison, 4th Tank Battalion, who had been in the thick of the June 16th battle, attended a war bonds rally in Detroit in late 1945. He found himself standing in the Detroit tank arsenal, the very factory that had built the Sherman he'd commanded on Saipan. Workers gathered around as he described the battle. When he finished, one worker, a middle-aged woman who had been building Shermans since 1942, asked him a question. "Did our tanks work okay? Did we build them right?" Morrison later recalled his answer. "I told her yes, your tanks worked fine. But what won the battle wasn't how good the tanks were. It was how many you built. I fought in one Sherman. Behind me were 100 more. Behind those were 1,000 more. Behind those were 10,000 more. That's what beat the Japanese. Not better tanks. More tanks. You didn't just build the machines. You built a system that couldn't be beaten." The woman nodded and returned to work. The assembly line continued. Even after the war ended, the Detroit tank arsenal kept producing Shermans until contracts were completed. Production didn't stop until November 1945, by which time Japan had surrendered, the emperor had renounced divinity, and American occupation forces were rebuilding Japanese industry on American industrial principles. Today, restored Type 97 Chiha tanks can be seen in museums across the world. The Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo displays one. The Imperial War Museum in London has another. The U.S. Army Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen Proving Grounds maintains a running example. These tanks sit beside Shermans in comparative displays that tell the story through steel and rivets better than any words. At the Yasukuni Shrine, a plaque beside the Type 97 reads, "This tank represents the courage of Japanese tankers who fought with honor against overwhelming odds. They died for their nation with weapons inadequate to their task and numbers insufficient to their mission. Their sacrifice is remembered." The truth, unspoken on the plaque, is harsher. Japanese tankers didn't die for inadequate weapons. They died because Japan's industrial base couldn't produce adequate weapons in adequate numbers. They died because Japan entered a war against an economy 12 times larger than their own and expected warrior spirit to overcome production statistics. Colonel Goto and his 9th Tank Regiment died on Saipan, not because they lacked courage or skill or determination. They died because behind every Sherman they faced stood the Detroit tank arsenal. Behind every Sherman stood the steel mills of Pittsburgh. Behind every Sherman stood an economic system that produced abundance through industrial freedom. Behind every Sherman stood 5 million tons of steel annually. The Japanese never imagined that Sherman tanks had 5 million tons of steel behind them. But that steel, more than the guns, more than the armor, more than the crews, was the weapon that won the Pacific War. Not because steel itself fights battles, but because the industrial capacity to produce steel in such quantities represented an economic advantage so overwhelming that no amount of tactical excellence could overcome it. In 1944, Japan produced 6.5 million tons of steel. America produced 80 million tons. That 12-to-1 ratio determined everything that followed. Every battle, every campaign, every desperate last stand by outmatched Japanese forces, all were predetermined by production statistics established before the first shot was fired. The Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha was not a bad tank. By 1942 standards, it was adequate. The Japanese tank crews were not bad soldiers. By any measure, they were brave, skilled, and determined. But adequacy and bravery meant nothing against the arithmetic of industrial warfare. In the equation of modern war, production capacity multiplies force. Japan had addition. America had multiplication. The outcome was never in doubt once American factories reached full production. At the Punch Bowl National Cemetery in Hawaii, where many of the American tank crewmen who fought at Saipan are buried, there is no mention of production statistics on the memorials. The inscriptions speak of courage, sacrifice, and victory. But the veterans who survived knew the truth. Lieutenant James Havison, who commanded a Sherman platoon through Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa, spoke at a reunion in 1985. "We remember the battles. We remember the men we lost. But we should also remember why we won. We won because America could build tanks faster than Japan could destroy them. We won because when my tank was knocked out on Tinian, I walked back to the beach and they gave me a new tank the next day. Brand new, full ammunition load, full fuel tanks, ready to go. The Japanese crew that knocked out my tank couldn't do that. When they lost a tank, it was gone forever." That was the difference. Not courage, not tactics, industrial capacity. We had it. They didn't. That's why we're here talking, and they're buried on islands 8,000 miles from home. The lesson of Japanese tanks versus American Shermans echoes through military history. Material matters, production matters, industrial capacity matters more than tactical brilliance, more than individual weapon superiority, more than warrior tradition. Wars between industrial nations are won in factories before they are fought on battlefields. Japan learned this lesson at catastrophic cost. Millions dead, cities destroyed, industrial capacity shattered. The warrior tradition that had sustained them for centuries was proven obsolete by assembly lines in Detroit. The Type 97 Kiha and its crews became symbols not of Japanese military failure, but of the futility of fighting industrial warfare without industrial capacity. The 49,234 Shermans that America built remain the ultimate answer to any question about how the Pacific War was won. Not because the Sherman was the best tank, it wasn't. Not because American tankers were the best soldiers, though they were certainly well-trained and brave. But because 49,000 of anything overwhelms 2,000 of anything when attrition is the mechanism of victory. Japan built the best tanks they could with the resources they had. They fought with courage and determination that deserved better equipment and better odds. But in industrial warfare, you don't fight with what you deserve. You fight with what your economy can produce. And Japan's economy, for all its efficiency and dedication, could not produce enough to challenge an American industrial base that outweighed it 12-1 in steel, 20-1 in oil, and hundreds to 1 in machine tools. The Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha was Japan's answer to modern armored warfare. The Sherman was America's answer, but the real answer, the answer that determined the Pacific War's outcome, was the industrial capacity that stood behind each tank. Japan never imagined Sherman tanks had 5 million tons of steel behind them. By the time they learned the truth, it was far too late to matter. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.